My name is Laya Crust. I'm a Toronto artist and I do Judaic. I love Tanakh. I love all the stories of the Torah. In 2010, I was approached by Rabbi Shalom Schachter and his wife Marcy Gilbert to create a Megillah. So I decided I would do this project, but what I had to do first was learn how to do the sofrut. I spent many months learning how to do the letters. And as you might notice, you can't have pencil lines on the cloth. You have to use embossed lines to pull your letters from. So that was one of the first things I also had to learn. Not to go with drawn lines, to go with embossed lines. I learned how to do sofrut, and I picked up all the materials I needed in Israel and in the United States. I couldn't find most of the things in Toronto. So the nibs, the parchment, the ink was all imported. I even bought the ink in Mea Shearim in Jerusalem. Now this Megillah is a special Megillah. At the top of each of 11 out of the 16 columns is the word Hamelech. So we see it here, we see it at the top of many other columns. The reason Hamelech is written like that on this Megillah is because God's name is not mentioned in the story of Esther. And this is the only book in Tanakh where God's name is not mentioned. But Hamelech is the acknowledgement that God is our King and is working behind the scenes for us at all times. The work that I decided to do was based on 15th century Persian manuscript art. And that's where I did my research, looking at these manuscripts for the decoration, for the architecture, and for the costume. In the first panel here, and there are 16 panels of lettering and 2 panels of art on the top and bottom of each of the columns of lettering. And those images relate to the text that's within the column of text. So this image at the top is Achashverosh, the king, Achashverosh's palace. In the next picture, we see King Achashverosh having a party with his attendants. And we see the sort of Persian patterning, the architecture here, and also Persian instruments. He calls for his queen, Vashti, to come dance before him and his friends, and we see Vashti saying no and turning her back on the attendants. My clients are very feminist, and they wanted to relay the strength of Vashti. So at the bottom, we see the ankh. This is at the bottom of her hem, the feminist symbol. And we also see one of the attendants looking on in dismay as she turns her back on the king's messengers. In the next column, the next image, we see Achashverosh talking to his attendants, trying to decide what to do about Vashti. And they decide that he should get rid of Vashti, his queen, and eventually he wants another queen. So he sends out a call across the land for young maidens to come and audition to be his queen. Here we see 2 of the stars of the scroll, Mordechai and his niece Esther. Esther and Mordechai are Jews who live in Shushan, and to indicate their Jewishness, I have Esther wearing a chai. We see the Magen David as a decoration at the top of the lattice work, and we see in the bookshelves wine for Kiddush, Shabbos candlesticks, wine glasses, and Jewish books. I tried to relate the costuming and the colors of the costuming to the characters. So here, Mordechai, and we'll see this throughout the Megillah, is wearing blue and white, kachol v'lavan, colors related that people identify with Judaism, and his cloak looks like a tallis. Esther is wearing red because even it's a strident color, and even though on her outside she's a very quiet woman, inside she's very strong and she has to be paid attention to, and that's why I have red as the color of her dress. On the next panel we see the women going and training to audition for the king. The women had to practice for 6 months to learn how to dance, to learn how to put on their makeup, and to get ready for court life. In this image, we see Achashverosh wearing his regal garments, turquoise and purple, choosing Esther as his queen. And we see that she has taken off her chai. Mordechai told her not to tell anybody she was Jewish. Now, we don't know why this was done, but this was part of God's hand in the way the story is going to play out. As Mordechai leaves the court, he hears two nobles plotting to kill the king, Bigtan and Teresh. Now, these two figures are based on Rabbi Shalom Schachter and his brother, who used to dress up as Bigtan and Teresh for Purim when they were little boys. And throughout the Megillah, I did introduce personal details of the lives of the Gilbert Schachter family into the imagery. In this panel, Haman is introduced. Haman is the bad guy in the story, and we see him wearing green. In Western culture, green is the color of envy and jealousy, and Haman is a very jealous, arrogant man, so I have him in green. He's angry because Mordechai, the Jew, refuses to bow down to him, and he decides if Mordechai the Jew refuses to bow down to him, he's going to kill all the Jews. He goes to King Achashverosh and says there's a group of people in the kingdom who do not behave the way everybody else behaves, and he asks permission to destroy them. And Achashverosh gives him permission. Here we see Haman with a declaration and offering Achashverosh money to be able to do this. We see the 15th century Persian horsemen going through the fields, because in this story they go across the kingdom of 127 provinces, and put up declarations, proclamations about this destruction of the Jews. So we see them with their letters in their carriers. In the next panel, Mordechai goes wearing sackcloth to tell Esther about what is happening. She sees him in the garden and sends her attendant out with new clothing for Mordechai to put in, because she doesn't want to see her uncle in sackcloth. But Mordechai refuses to put on the new clean clothing. Here she finds out about the declaration and bows her head. Mordechai tells her that she must go to Achashverosh and stand up for the Jews in order to save them. She decides to fast for 3 days. She gets her attendants to fast also, and tells all the Jews of Shushan that they must fast. And then she dresses up in her regal clothing to go speak to Achashverosh. We see here the sleeves of her gown come right over her hands, and that was something that was done in the Persian courts. The clothing was made of silk. It was often very ornate, and the sleeves were often very, very long, sometimes as long as the floor. And this is what noble people wore, and it proved that they were so important they didn't have to do anything to use their hands. And you'll see in other panels that there is a way that the hands can be put through the sleeves so that they can expose their hands in order to do things. Haman and Achashverosh are invited to a special dinner that Esther is going to make for them. And here Haman is bragging to his wife Zeresh. Zeresh also has the long sleeves, and the color that she's wearing is yellow, and that shows her jaundiced personality. King Achashverosh can't sleep. We see him lying in his room, and he calls his attendant to read to him from the Book of Memories. One of the things that's in the Book of Memories is that incident of Mordechai reporting on Bigtan and Teresh, Achashverosh realizes he has never rewarded Mordechai. At that very moment, Haman comes because he wants to hang Mordechai the next day. But in a twist of fate, Achashverosh says to him, "What should I do to a man I want to reward?" Haman says, "Dress him up in the king's clothing and put him on a horse and go through the streets proclaiming his greatness." So it ends up that Haman, to his embarrassment and shame and anger, has to lead Mordechai through the streets because it's Mordechai Achashverosh wanted to reward. In the next panel, Haman has hurried over to go to the feast that Esther is hosting. Here we see Esther, Achashverosh, and Haman all sitting in the court enjoying, eating pomegranates, drinking wine, and having a good time. There's another feast called, again, with Haman, Achashverosh, and Esther. But in that feast, Esther tells Achashverosh that there is an evil man in the country who wants to destroy her and all her people. Achashverosh gets very angry and says, "Who is he? Who is this man?" And she points at Haman and says, "He is the man who wants to destroy us." Haman throws himself on Esther to ask for mercy. Achashverosh turns around, sees Haman, and thinks that he is trying to violate his queen Esther, and sends Haman to get hanged.